You've tuned in to our session this evening. We're so glad that you've turned up, and we want you to be active in the chat in this session. Don't just sit back. Don't just think, that's it, I'm just going to put the TV on and watch this. We want you to be actively engaged. We want to see you chatting to each other, which I can see you already doing, already saying hello to one another, but be active in the conversation, because this is something that we want you to be involved in. And as we always say at Everyday Champions, this is a conversation. This is not about me or us preaching at you. This is a conversation that we all want to be involved in as we go on this discipleship journey. And as we've been looking at over the past few weeks, we've been talking about this thing called the proximity principle, where we're looking about how we need to be close to Jesus. We need to apply this principle to our lives because it directly affects our discipleship journey. And obviously through this proximity principle series, we've been looking at the I am sayings of Jesus in the Gospel of John. Now, this isn't school, and most of us have really kind of negative connotations when we think about school. I certainly do. But I want us to do a little bit of homework. I want us to go and read through the I am sayings of John's Gospel, the I'm sayings of Jesus, in John's Gospel, because it really helps us when we get an understanding of the context, the whole picture. And I love John's Gospel. It's easy to read. It's not difficult. So there's some homework for you to do. Should you accept the challenge for you to go and do that, as we're kind of at the halfway point of this series. And this kind of session that we're going to go through today is probably going to be one of the most personal applications of the I am sayings of Jesus. And what I mean in that is that it really needs to impact us in a personal way, because we really need to apply this principle, like I said, so we can be able to articulate really well who Jesus is to me, who Jesus is to you. Because if someone was to ask you that question or ask me that question, who is Jesus to you? I would hope that we'd be ready to give a really good answer, an answer from our hearts, not from our heads, because it's easy to know about somebody and learn about them. But there's something different when we actually know them for ourselves. And before we get into the session, before we get into a kind of a deeper discussion, I want to ask a general question, so you can pop this in the chat. You can talk about this for a little while amongst yourselves. And this question is, do you like to be taken care of, or are you fiercely independent? Okay, so do you like to be taken care of, or are you fiercely independent? And let's be honest in the chat. It's okay. There's no judgment here. Nobody's going to say this is a right or wrong answer. We're just being honest about whether you like to be taken care of or whether you are fiercely independent. Now, the reality is none of us really like to go, oh, yes, I want to be taken care of. But guess what? I do. I like to be taken care of. I'm a needy person. I like to be looked after. However, there is a fierce independent streak in myself. And it reminds me of when our kids were little, when they were kind of growing up and they went from being babies to toddlers and learning to do things. And it was so frustrating when you would just want to help them, but you couldn't, because this fierce independent streak ran through them and they would go, no, do it. They'd want to do it themselves. And but if we're honest, that can be in us all, even when we know we need to ask for help, even when we know that we should be taken care of. We like to appear independent, because to say that we need to be taken care of or to say that we need help can appear weak. And so we like to say that we're independent, we don't need anyone, we can do it ourselves. And the world, in a way, conditions us like that, to believe that we don't need anyone else. You're strong on your own. You don't need to be taken care of. But the fact is, even though we appear as independent and on the surface we might have that kind of cool, calm exterior, the reality is that we all need care. We all need to be taken care of. You see, I'm reminded of this when I read that really famous Psalm 23, when it talks about the Lord is my shepherd. If you've got a Bible right now, you can go and look that up. And really, none of us have got an excuse, because I'm sure we've all got devices. We're either watching on one or whatever. You can go to an online Bible and look at Psalm 23, an incredible psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. But the problem is when we read this psalm or when we listen to it, very often we can get a very old-fashioned, incorrect picture of Jesus. And it's often, I know that sometimes in the past when I've read it, I've kind of gone back to those old romantic pictures in kind of poetry books or history books, whatever. And Jesus is depicted as this person with flowing blonde hair and blue eyes and milky white skin, and he's got perfectly manicured hands that are held out to this baby fluffy sheep, and everything's just perfect. It's very kind of the English romantic poet image of Jesus. And that has shaped a lot of today's thinking for people of who Jesus is. This irrelevant romantic figure seen on a tapestry or up in a picture in an old book somewhere. And this image is so wrong. So wrong. For a start, Jesus wouldn't have had blonde hair and blue eyes. Just because of his background, his race, he would have had very dark skin and dark hair and eyes. And being a shepherd was not about being this meek and pathetic person holding a fluffy little lamb in the air. It was something completely different. And what I want us to do in this session is kind of help correct some of that, or to establish it or re-establish this idea of who Jesus is in these verses and how this links to John's gospel and his I am sayings. Because this week we're going to talk about where Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And let's read it together from John 10 and verse 11. So this is just moving on slightly from what we were talking about in the last session. It's part of the same kind of chapter where John was talking about Jesus saying, I'm the gate for the sheep. And then we go on to read about the shepherd. And it says, I am the good shepherd, Jesus speaking. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, I lay my life down for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of the sheepfold. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay my life down, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. So Jesus says there twice, I am the good shepherd. And that's the whole kind of background to this, why I've talked about Psalm 23 and what we're going to be talking about in terms of care and how we need to be taken care of. Because the biblical shepherd, the biblical image of the shepherd is not one like I referred to a few moments ago, as you would have seen in an old kind of painting or tapestry. The biblical shepherd is a brave and strong person. And David, we read about King David before he was king, he was a shepherd boy that grew into a shepherd, and he fought the lion and the bear to protect his sheep. You can read that in 1 Samuel 17. And he, David, is the one who wrote Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. So he was saying it from a point of understanding who a shepherd really is, because he lived that out himself. When he was writing that, obviously he didn't know Jesus at the time. Jesus came later. But when he was writing that about God, it was a prophetic picture of who Jesus is to us. But he understood because he was a shepherd. And then David then became known as the shepherd king and later the king of Israel. You see, shepherds would have been ready to fight off wild animals, ready to protect those sheep single-handedly. They would have worked in a harsh and tough stretch of land. There would have been the extreme temperatures of hot and cold in a place with wilderness and rocky areas and dangerous mountain valleys, and where they would have to find water and rescue and good pasture for the sheep. And they would have had to ensure that the sheep were fed correctly. The shepherd would have faced the threat of robbers and thieves, as we obviously read there in John 10. And there would be people who would want to come steal the flock. Then we talk about the hired hand. He would have had to have looked after them. And so protecting the sheep as a shepherd could have cost him his life. He would have had to have fought off these wild animals, gone through all kinds of difficult conditions to protect his sheep, because they were his livelihood as a shepherd. but also he would have loved the sheep and cared for them. And so we might view this pastoral role of the shepherd as caring, which is right, but in no way is the role of the shepherd somebody who is non-confrontational, someone who is tolerant, someone who is inoffensive or weak, as we might possibly have understood him. You see, when we understand Jesus like that, as a non-confrontational kind of weak, placid kind of shepherd, it will directly affect our discipleship journey. And of course, we're talking about those signs of a healthy disciple, the 5 objectives that we need to adhere to make sure that we're on the right track. And if we don't see Jesus correctly, if we don't apply this proximity principle to our lives when we come really close to the good shepherd, it will affect our journey. It will affect how we impact the world around us. You see, when we see Jesus in the wrong way, in the way that I kind of described at first, it means that we might be willing to allow stuff to just be, we kind of just wing it in our life. Because Jesus loves me anyway. He's this wonderful shepherd who just loves me. Or he'll tolerate my sin because he cares for me. It doesn't matter. And we enter into dangerous territory. When we view Jesus in the wrong way, it will affect our discipleship. And if we want to affect the world around us, then we need to ensure our proximity to the shepherd is closer than close, and we understand fully and truly who he is, so that we can really grow in our faith and in our discipleship. You see, when we read that Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd," we have to make sure our understanding is correct. Or if we're going to echo the words of David in Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd," we need to know who we're talking about and what that means. Now, for a moment, I'm going to go back to the good old Pharisees that we always talk about, and we kind of shake our heads at these religious leaders who thought that they knew it all and thought that they had it all together because they looked the part, but they lacked that spiritual awakening. They were convinced that Jesus was a fake, that he was blasphemous, and that he was an imposter. And they didn't like that Jesus was shaking up society, not for the sake of it, but to bring a revelation and a reformation and bring transformation to the people. They didn't like that he was shaking up their religious beliefs and their traditions. He was ruffling their feathers. And in this chapter of John 10, just a few verses before, we read this in our last session, the Pharisees were investigating this healing of the blind man, saying about Jesus that this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. And they judged him on his behavior, not on who he is. And so here we are a few verses later. Jesus is addressing them and their unbelief. And what they failed to see was Jesus was actually proving that he is the Messiah. He is the one that they have been waiting for. He is the Savior of the world. He is God, but they couldn't see it. You see, there's the prophecy that we read in Ezekiel, a book in the Bible. You can go and read it for yourself, a prophetic book. And in Ezekiel 34, there's this prophetic message that came many years before Jesus, that there would be a shepherd who would come and take care of the sheep, us, people. And that the shepherds, in inverted commas, the leaders of the people in Israel had failed at their jobs because they cared too much about themselves. And we essentially are called sheep without a shepherd. God's people are called sheep without a shepherd. And it says this in Ezekiel 34, verse 11. I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I will look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines and all the settlements of the land. I will tend them in good pasture, and the mountain heights of Israel will be their grazing land. There they will lie down in good grazing land, and there they will feed in rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I myself will tend my sheep and will make them lie down, declares the sovereign Lord. I will search for the lost and bring back the strays. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak, but the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. Now, if you know Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, you will see there is a real familiarity in those verses there about what Jesus does, that he leads us beside quiet waters. He restores our soul. He brings us into that pasture. Jesus, who is that in that prophetic message in Ezekiel 34, and also I believe in Psalm 23, is shown here. So when Jesus is saying in John 10, or hundreds of years later, to these Pharisees, and he calls himself, I am the good shepherd. He wasn't just trying to appeal to their nice nature and be kind and say, oh, I'm a nice shepherd, I'll look after you. By saying, I am the good shepherd, he is showing that he is the promised Messiah that is spoken about in so many different places, but here in Ezekiel, and obviously we read in the Psalms, but they still didn't realize what he was saying. And it affected their journey. Now, what I want us to do really quickly in the kind of the second half, the last part of our session together, I want to look at 3 quick things, and we're going to look at some questions as well for you to answer in your circles and discuss in your circles, because this isn't just about me talking. This is about you having a discussion and a conversation. And so make sure that you're making notes, write these questions down, these thoughts down, ready for you to take into your circles, whether they are in person or online, because I really hope that this session brings us into this personal application of who Jesus is to us, so that it can affect our discipleship journey. And the first thing is this: the shepherd owns you. The shepherd owns you. You see, there's a little bit of squirming when we talk about being owned. There's a little bit of squirming that goes on inside of our hearts when we talk about being owned, because in a way, when we talk about something being owned or someone being owned, it can bring about this thought of being objectified, to treat a person like that they are a thing, that they have no feelings, opinions, or rights of their own, to say that they're being owned. But what I want to help us see through these verses in John 10 and everything that we've been talking about is that is the complete opposite. You see, Jesus laid his feelings and his rights down so that we could experience freedom. So when we say that the shepherd owns us as his sheep, this isn't about us losing who we are. This is about us finding who we are. You see, everybody struggles for freedom. We all just don't want to be owned like property, obviously. And we should never be owned by other humans. We can only be owned by God, or we will be owned by our own sin. You see, what if we fully understood that when we are owned, when we come to Jesus, that actually it's one of the best things that can happen to us as a human being? To be owned by God, to be called his special possession. It says in 1 Peter, I forget the exact chapter, but it talks about that we are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that we may declare the praises of him who has called us out of darkness into light. That we are his special prize possession. So to be owned by the shepherd is actually one of the best things that could happen to us. You see, in verse 12 of chapter 10 that we've read, it says, the hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when the hired hand sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Jesus will never run away and leave us on our own because he owns us. It says the hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. The good shepherd, we need to desire, we want to love being owned by Jesus. I remember some time ago, I read an excerpt from a book by a sheep farmer. It's not something that I would necessarily read about, but it caught my eye because it was actually a Christian who in modern day looked after sheep. And he wrote this book about his understanding of what it would be to be a shepherd now, knowing Jesus as the good shepherd. And he explained that the day that he bought his first 30 sheep or ewes, and his farmer neighbor came and sat down with him and looked at the sheep and admired them, and they were strong, and he was like, I love them, these are my livelihood, but I care for them, they belong to him, he owned them. And the neighbor farmer turned to him and handed him this huge kind of knife, a sharp knife, and said, well, now they're yours. Now you have to put your mark on them. And this guy, the shepherd, said he knew exactly what he meant, because each shepherd would use their own distinctive mark to mark the sheep so that others would know who they belonged to, and they would do it in the ear of the sheep. And so, by doing this, even at a distance, they would be able to recognize who their sheep were. And it wasn't the most pleasant procedure to catch each ewe or each sheep and lay their ear down on the wooden block and literally notch deeply into their ear with a sharp knife. There was pain. There was pain for the sheep, but there was also pain for the shepherd to do that, knowing that it hurt them. But through that kind of mutual suffering, there was this indelible, lifelong mark of ownership on the sheep that would mean that it could never be erased. And from that moment on, every sheep that came into that shepherd's possession would bear the mark of the shepherd. Isn't that incredible? That we should bear the mark of Jesus. And obviously you can read about that in the Old Testament, where it talks about slavery and how they would wear an earring, and it would be a sign of the fact that they would belong to somebody. But now we're owned by God. We're not slaves to sin. We're slaves to serving Jesus, and how incredible that is. Because true freedom comes by being owned by the Good Shepherd. We're literally set apart. We're earmarked. That's where that term comes from. We're set apart for his good works, what he wants us to do. And that's why when we understand being owned by him, we walk into the freedom of who we've actually been designed to be. You see, this idea comes as well from Exodus 21, and it talks about the laws set for the people of God regarding servants. It says, if the servant declares, I love my master, and my wife and children do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. Then he will take him to the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life. Isn't that incredible? That idea there that you are literally put with somebody for the rest of your life to serve them. I'm thankful that I am earmarked by Jesus, that I am owned by him, that I will be his servant for life. Being owned by Jesus isn't a restriction of my freedom. It's about stepping into all that I am designed and created to be. So write this question down, because this is something that you're going to take into your circle, something that you're going to discuss and bring into conversation. And the question is this: who or what are you in danger of being owned by? Who or what are you in danger of being owned by? Because here comes the question, not do you want to be owned? Because the reality is that we are all owned, but it's who is going to own you. Because if you are not owned by Jesus, then you're being owned by your own sin. And so it's important for us to look at what we are in danger of being owned by, or who we're being owned by. You see, when we read about living life to the full, we understand, as Jesus said in John 10:10, that he has come to give us life in all its fullness. If we choose Jesus, then we choose to bear his mark. The second thing is this: the shepherd knows you. The shepherd not just owns you, but he knows you. You see, verse 3 of that same chapter in John 10, it says that the watchman opens the gate for him. The sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he's brought them all out, when he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. You know, when my children were little, when they were younger, if we went to a play park or soft play or whatever, there could be dozens and dozens of other children. But when my child shouted out, "Mummy," I would know that they were mine. I could recognize their voice because I know them. And when they were young, particularly, I knew them intimately. I knew who they were. Every cry, every sound, I would go, that's my child. You see, God doesn't just recognize us. He knows us. Today I was just walking up from parking the car, and I was just chatting on the phone, and I saw somebody that I follow on Instagram, not a friend. They don't know me. Somebody semi-famous. And for a moment, it stopped me in my tracks. I was a bit like, do I say hello? They don't know me. And I don't really know them. I only see a version of them, of what's shown on their Instagram account. Because I recognized them. but I don't know them. You see, God doesn't just recognize us and go, oh, yeah, I know them. They're so and so. No, he knows us intimately. It's not just that we are familiar to him, we are favored by him. Like I said in those verses, we are God's special possession. But it goes even deeper than that. God doesn't just know you, but he knows everything about you. He knows your hidden hurts, the hidden depths of your heart and your mind, your dreams, your desires. He knows the trouble you're in. He knows the hurts, the wounds. He knows everything. Things that you haven't even spoken about because you dare not say them out loud. God knows them all. He knows every single inch of you. Go and read that in another psalm, because he wants to know you. But the real question is here, do you want to know him? You see, Psalm 23 that we talked about, the Lord is my shepherd, talks about how your rod and staff, they comfort me. And let's just go back to Ezekiel. We're hopping around today. Go back to Ezekiel, a different chapter, chapter 20. There's another prophetic word from God. And it says this, I will take note of you as you pass under my rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. Let me say that again. It says, this is Ezekiel 20:37. We haven't got this verse on the screen. I will take note of you as you pass under my rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. You're saying, what on earth is that all about? You see, this means that when we are coming into the ownership of the shepherd, we're not just coming under their authority and judgment, but we're also coming under their care. Remember what I asked you at the start? Do you like to be cared for, or you are fiercely independent? The fact is, when we come to Jesus, we come under his authority, but we also come under his care and his careful, intimate examination. You see, in caring for the sheep, the good shepherd is a good manager. And from time to time, I know that shepherds will examine the sheep individually to make sure that they're okay. As each sheep comes through the gate, it is stopped by the shepherd's rod, which speaks of authority and guidance. But you see, as they come under that authority, he will use the rod to pull back their fur and their wool to see if there are any wounds, any cuts, if something's caught in their fur, something's wrong, any sign of trouble. He will examine the sheep with care to see that everything is okay. And this process is an intimate process. It's to comfort the sheep, and the good shepherd will search and run his hands through and make sure that each sheep is okay. That is what God does to us. He has this intimate examination of us to make sure in our hearts, are you okay? I want to know what your hidden hurts are, what your dreams and desires are. He wants to know you, but we have to apply that proximity principle. We have to choose to come close to him. If you keep running off, and if I keep running off like a silly sheep and escaping his care, it won't work. We have to choose to come to him because he knows you, but he desires to know you more. And we have to desire to know him more. The third and final thing is this. The shepherd rescued us. The shepherd owns us, he knows us, but he has rescued us. You see, I think probably the most powerful and poignant message in this chapter of John is Jesus' claim that he is the good shepherd, because he lays down his life for his sheep. The shepherd literally takes the place of the sheep. It was prophesied in Isaiah 53 verse 5-7. It says, we all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him, the good shepherd, the iniquity of us all, or the sin of us all, the wrongdoing of us all. And this is actually where I'm going to stop. And you're like, what? This is the pinnacle. You need to unpack this more. No, this is where I'm going to stop, because this is where I want you to carry on the study for yourself before you go to your circle conversations. Because the main question for this circle session today is this: what have you been rescued from? What have you been rescued from? And honestly, this is an opportunity for us to share our stories. You see, maybe the people in your circle have never heard your story before, or maybe they've heard it many, many times. But this is our opportunity to either share it for the first time or remind those around us of what Jesus has done, how far we've come, and how much we are in need of the Good Shepherd. So when we look at this last point, that the shepherd, the good shepherd, has rescued us, really, I want you to kind of do the study before you go into your circle. So don't leave this till the last minute. I'm not meaning to sound like a school teacher here. Don't leave this till the last minute. Go and do it right now after you've listened to this session. Go and write down all the things that Jesus has rescued you from now, with the kind of backdrop of everything that we've talked about. Take that into your circle and really talk about what you've been rescued from. You know, I really hope that in your discussions and the conversations in your circle, that there's a vulnerability, that there's an openness as we begin to share our stories with those who we trust, that there's actually praise that goes on. There's worship that goes on to Jesus when we talk about what he's rescued us from, but also it inspires hope in other people listening to your story. It inspires hope and faith in them. As always, I want you to go and do the ABCs. A, what have you become aware of? Maybe for the first time, or maybe you've been reminded of it. What have you become aware of in this session? B, what's the barrier to growth in this area? What's the obstacle? What's getting in the way here? What are you not dealing with that is really preventing you from moving forward? And C, what's the change? What's the goal? What's the challenge that you're going to bring to your life so that you can see yourself moving from one degree of glory to another on this discipleship journey? And I want you to look at those 5 objectives of a healthy disciple, 5 signs of a healthy disciple, what we need to be aligning ourselves to so that we can see that we're doing well on our discipleship journey. You see, when we align ourselves to those things, it helps us. It's like a bit of a map. It helps us see what we're doing, whether we're doing the right thing, and how this really does apply to our everyday life. So I'm going to pray for us as we close. Hopefully you've got some notes and you've taken these questions down ready for you to take into your sessions. But I really want to pray that everything that we've talked about really sparks a brand new revelation in our hearts. Jesus, we thank you that you are the Good Shepherd. There is nothing and there is no one like you. That Jesus, I thank you that in those verses that we read in John's Gospel, of where you were explaining who you are through the I am sayings, that it wasn't just, as we said, simply appealing to their nice side of their nature. You weren't just sweet talking them. You were revealing that you were the prophesied Messiah from thousands of years before you even came to the earth. Jesus, we thank you that we are now living in that promise, that you have saved us, that you have rescued us, that you own us, that you know us, that you care about us. God, help us to not be so fiercely independent that we don't choose to come under your care, so that we can apply this proximity principle to our lives, so that we can know you more. God, give us a hunger and a thirst to really know you as our Good Shepherd, just as you know us intimately as individuals, that you care for us one-on-one. God, help us to desire to be close to you. Help us to see that your rod and your staff, they do guide and comfort us. Help us to choose to come under your care so that we can know you for who you truly are, and we can answer that question of who you are to us. Jesus, we love you. We thank you and we worship you. Amen. Amen. Well, go and have a great conversation in your circles. Make sure you're vulnerable and open, and we look forward to seeing you next time.